A stranger stepped out of an alley, pressed a key into my hand, and whispered 2 words I can't get out of my head. Don't use it. I should have walked away. I should have thrown it out. But I didn't. And what happened next, I'll never forget. It happened in broad daylight. That's what still scares me the most. Not a dark alley at midnight. Not a lonely road with no streetlights. No, this happened while the sun was shining, and the street was full of people going about their day. Michael was walking home from work, his mind drifting between what to have for dinner and the small pile of bills waiting on his kitchen counter. The afternoon was warm, the kind of weather that makes you slow down and take your time. He passed a corner bakery, its windows fogged from the heat of fresh bread. A bus rumbled by, the sound of its brakes squealing against the chatter of pedestrians. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. From the shadow of a narrow alley, a man stepped into Michael's path. He wasn't like the usual street wanderers Michael sometimes saw. His clothes were worn, frayed at the cuffs, as if he had been wearing them for years without change. The fabric was old-fashioned, something you'd see in photograph from decades ago. But it was his eyes that stopped Michael cold. They were locked on him, sharp, intense, and urgent. Not angry, not pleading, just filled with something Michael couldn't name, like he was trying to communicate a warning without words. Before Michael could step aside, the man's hand shot forward. Something cold and heavy dropped into Michael's palm, a small brass key. It was no ordinary key. The metal was tarnished with age, its surface covered in strange markings. Not letters, not numbers, symbols, carved deep as though someone had scratched them in with a knife. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word came out, the man leaned in. His breath was icy, his lips almost brushing Michael's ear as he whispered, slow and deliberate, "Don't use it." The voice was quiet, but it was a kind of quiet that stays with you, sinking into your bones. Then, just as quickly, the man turned and walked back into the alley. Michael blinked. It was only a few steps to the alley entrance, yet by the time he looked, the man was gone. No footsteps, no shadow moving away, just an empty, narrow stretch between 2 buildings, as if the man had never been there at all. He stood there for a long moment, the key warm in his hand, his mind replaying the scene over and over. People passed by, some glancing at him curiously, but no one else seemed to have noticed the stranger. Michael slipped the key into his pocket. It felt heavier than it should have, pulling at the fabric as if it wanted to be noticed. The rest of the walk home felt different. Shadows seemed longer. Every sound, a car horn, a distant shout, the flap of a pigeon's wings, made him turn his head. By the time he reached his apartment door, the key felt like it was burning against his leg. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hand under the hallway light. Up close, the carvings were even stranger. Some of them looked like tiny arrows. Others were curved, almost like half-moons. And in the middle, one single circle with a line cutting through it. Michael didn't know why, but he felt like the key was watching him. Not literally, of course, but there was an undeniable weight to it, a sense that it was more than just an object. He placed it on his kitchen counter and tried to shake it off. It was just a key, a weird encounter with a weirder man. That's all. But later, as he sat on the couch watching TV, his eyes kept drifting to the counter. The key seemed to catch the light in ways it shouldn't, gleaming faintly even when the lamp was off. He remembered the man's voice, those 3 words, "Don't use it." Michael told himself it was nonsense, but a part of him, deep down, knew something wasn't right, and he couldn't stop wondering. If he wasn't supposed to use it, then what would happen if he did? Michael stared at the object resting in his palm, the late afternoon light catching its surface just enough to reveal the details. It was old, older than anything he had ever held before. The brass was worn, dulled with time, but solid and heavier than it looked, as though it carried more than just metal within it. The teeth of the key were sharp and oddly shaped, each cut precise but unfamiliar, and along its shaft, strange symbols had been carved. They weren't letters from any language he knew, not numbers either. They looked more like marks from another world, Some were jagged and harsh, like lightning bolts frozen in metal. Others curved gracefully, resembling moons in different phases. In the center of it all, just below the bowl of the key, was a single circle with a line slicing through it. The more Michael stared at it, the more it seemed less like decoration and more like a warning. A shiver ran down his spine. The stranger's voice still echoed in his mind. "Don't use it." The tone had been so deliberate, so cold, that it was impossible to dismiss. It wasn't the kind of thing you said just to be mysterious. It had felt like the man meant it, like there was something truly dangerous about this key. That night, Michael placed the key on his bedside table. The metal felt cold against the wood, and for a moment he almost considered putting it somewhere else, somewhere out of sight. But that felt ridiculous. It was just a key, an object, nothing more. He turned off the lamp and lay back in bed. The city outside his window was alive, cars passing, distant chatter, the occasional siren, the usual soundtrack that always lulled him to sleep. But tonight, the sound wasn't comforting. Every creak in the building seemed louder. Every gust of wind rattling the window made him open his eyes. And every time he closed them, he heard it again, that whisper, low and cold in his ear. Don't use it. It wasn't memory anymore. It felt present, like the man was still there, standing beside the bed. Michael rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around him, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the thought wouldn't leave. Why give someone a key and then tell them not to use it? By midnight, he was still wide awake. He sat up in bed and glanced at the key. Even in the dim light from the street lamp outside, it seemed to gleam faintly. The idea started to claw at his thoughts. Keys existed to open things. Doors, chests, locks. That was their purpose. So what did this one open? A door to a storage unit? A safety deposit box? A locked cabinet in some forgotten building? He imagined it unlocking an ancient wooden door somewhere, a place untouched for decades, maybe longer. He imagined dust, cobwebs, and the smell of old paper. Or maybe it opened something smaller, a music box, a hidden drawer. But the symbols on it didn't fit any of those ideas. They weren't decorative in the way an ornate antique key might be. They felt functional, like they meant something specific and important. The more he thought about it, the more questions formed in his head. Had the stranger been the key's owner? Had he stolen it? Was he giving it away, or passing on a burden? And why Michael? Why stop him in the middle of the street, out of all the people walking by, and choose him? By 1 a.m., Michael gave up trying to sleep. He turned on the lamp and picked up the key again. It was warmer than before, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, not in the dark of his room. The weight of it in his hand was unsettling, as though it was pulling him somewhere, not physically, but in his mind. He turned it over and over, his fingers tracing the grooves of the symbols. They were deep, carved with precision. Not something done by hand with a shaky tool, but with intent, with skill. And that circle with a line through it. He couldn't stop staring at it. It was like an eye, always watching. A thought crossed his mind that made his stomach knot. What if the warning hadn't been to protect him, but to protect whatever was on the other side of the lock this key belonged to? The idea should have been enough to make him put it away. Lock it in a drawer, forget about it, move on with his life. But instead, it did the opposite. Now, he wanted, no, needed, to know, what door could it possibly open? And what would happen if he did? The next morning, something strange happened. Michael woke to the pale light of early morning streaming through the blinds. His eyes drifted toward the bedside table where the key lay exactly as he'd left it. But the moment his fingers touched the metal, he froze. It wasn't just warm. It was almost hot, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight. He pulled his hand back instinctively, the heat leaving a faint tingling in his fingertips. For a moment, the apartment was silent, until he heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice, like a click. It wasn't the sharp snap of a door lock or the metallic clink of keys rattling. It was slower, deliberate, almost like something inside the key had shifted. Michael blinked hard and leaned closer, holding the key to his ear. Nothing. He told himself he'd imagined it, probably just the sound of the metal cooling after being in his warm palm. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. At work, he couldn't concentrate. His office overlooked a busy street, a constant blur of pedestrians, honking cars, and delivery trucks. But sometime before noon, he caught sight of a figure across the street, standing perfectly still. The man's clothes were dark, shapeless against the bright morning, and though he was far away, Michael felt those eyes on him. Sharp, focused, the same way they'd been when the stranger had handed him the key. Michael sat back in his chair, heart thudding in his chest. The man didn't move, didn't look away. But when Michael stood up and stepped toward the window for a better view, the street was empty. A bus had just passed, but there was no sign of the man, no hurried figure walking away, no shadow slipping into a doorway. Nothing. By mid-afternoon, it happened again. Michael was typing when he felt it, the prickling awareness of being watched. He looked up and there he was again, standing in the exact same spot as before, staring straight at him. Michael's throat went dry. This time he didn't look away. He kept his gaze locked, hoping to catch the man moving, to prove to himself it wasn't some trick of his mind. But the instant a co-worker stopped by his desk to ask a question, Michael glanced away for barely a second. And when he looked back, the man was gone again. No footsteps, no crowd, no explanation. By evening, Michael had given up trying to ignore it. The key had been in his jacket pocket all day, and every time he reached for something else, he could feel its weight. Not heavy in the usual way, more like it was pressing against him, demanding attention. And every time his fingers brushed the strange carved symbols, a wave of unease mixed with something else. Curiosity. That curiosity had been growing since the night he first saw the key. Now, it was like a constant whisper in the back of his mind. Not words, just a pull, an urge to find it. By the time he walked through his apartment door that evening, the decision had already been made. He tossed his bag on the couch and took the key from his pocket, holding it in the fading light from a window. It was warm again. No, hotter, and as he turned it in his hand, he could almost see the faint shimmer of the carved symbols, as if light were trapped inside the grooves. Michael set it down on the table and sat in front of it, elbows on his knees. He thought about the stranger's face, about the deliberate way he had whispered those 3 words. Don't use it. The warning had been too specific, too loaded. It wasn't random. It was meant to keep him away. And the more he thought about it, the more that warning felt less like protection and more like a challenge. He pictured the key sliding into an old lock somewhere, the tumblers clicking into place, a door creaking open to reveal. What? Treasure? Secrets? Or something that shouldn't be found? The truth was, he didn't care anymore. Not knowing was worse than any danger his imagination could conjure. He leaned back in his chair, fingers curling around the key once again. The metal seemed to thrum faintly, almost like a heartbeat. By the time the sun had fully set, Michael's mind was made up. He was going to find out where this key belonged. And if the stranger really didn't want that to happen, well, it was too late. The curiosity had won. On the 3rd night, Michael couldn't explain it. Not to himself, not to anyone. It wasn't a thought, or an idea, or even a conscious decision. It was a pull. A steady, invisible current tugging at him from somewhere beyond the city streets. By the time the sun had set, the pull was unbearable. He found himself walking without a destination, the key warm in his pocket, his hand brushing against it with every step. The streets grew quieter as he moved away from the main roads. Neon signs gave way to flickering street lamps. The air smelled faintly of rust and rain, even though the day had been dry. He reached the old industrial district, a place he rarely visited, a place that felt like the city's forgotten corner. The buildings here were tall and narrow, their brick facades scarred by time. Graffiti covered cracked walls, weeds grew through broken pavement, and the occasional gust of wind rattled loose sheets of metal siding. That's when he saw it. A building he was certain had never been there before. It wasn't like the others. It was taller, darker, its silhouette unnaturally sharp against the night sky. All its windows were shattered, jagged glass clinging stubbornly to warped frames. The street around it was empty, no cars, no people, not even the hum of a distant engine. In the center of the building's rusted metal facade was a door. It was massive, with thick, corroded hinges that looked as though they hadn't been moved in decades. But what caught Michael's eye was a keyhole, small, precise, and placed right in the middle. A perfect match for his key. Michael froze. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to leave. The stranger's voice rang in his head, louder than it had ever been. Don't use it. It wasn't a memory now. It was as if the man was standing right behind him, whispering into his ear again. His breathing quickened. His hand tightened in his pocket, feeling the weight of the key pressing into his palm. He almost turned back. Almost. But then, like a scene playing without his permission, his arm moved. His hand came out of his pocket, the key glinting faintly under the weak streetlight. His feet stepped forward, one slow stride after another, crunching over bits of broken glass that littered the sidewalk. The key slid into the lock with perfect precision, no resistance, no awkward angle, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The sound it made was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't the usual click of tumblers falling into place. It was deeper, sharper, like metal screaming, an echo that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The vibration ran up his arm, through his chest, and into the back of his skull. Michael's breath caught. The air around him felt heavier, pressing against his skin like a storm cloud ready to break. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight. Slowly, the massive door creaked inward. It didn't open smoothly. It resisted, groaning as though it was fighting against him, reluctant to let him inside. A draught of cold air spilled out, smelling faintly of damp stone, rust, and something older, something he couldn't name. Beyond the doorway was darkness, not the kind that comes with night. This was thicker, almost physical, as though it could wrap around you and pull you under. For a moment, Michael hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to slam the door shut, to walk away and never look back. But his curiosity was stronger. It had been growing for days, and now it roared in his mind, drowning out every warning. He took a single step inside. The darkness seemed to swallow the light from the street behind him. The air was colder here, sharp, biting at his lungs. He couldn't see more than a foot ahead, but he could feel the space stretching out around him, wide and empty. And then something moved. It was only for a second, a faint, shuffling sound from deeper inside, like fabric brushing stone. Michael's hand tightened around the key, still lodged in the lock behind him. A thought crossed his mind. He could pull it out, lock the door, and leave. But his feet stayed where they were. The pull was still there, stronger now. Whatever was inside this place, it had been waiting for him. The door swung open into darkness, but not the kind you see at night. This darkness had weight. It felt thick, almost physical, as if it could wrap itself around you and drag you under. It moved in subtle ways, shifting, curling, and retreating like breath. The first thing Michael noticed was a cold. The air was so frigid it cut through his clothes instantly, biting into his skin. Yet somehow his shirt clung to his back with sweat. Every muscle in his body was telling him to step away, to slam the door shut, but his feet didn't move. From deep within the black, something stirred. Shapes began to form. Not clearly, just vague outlines at first, moving with a strange, jerky grace. They were human in height and shape, but wrong. Their edges seemed to melt into the darkness, as if they weren't entirely solid. When they moved, their limbs bent just slightly the wrong way, like reflections in a warped mirror. One figure stepped forward. The closer it came, the more Michael's stomach twisted. Its face was his. Not just similar, identical. Every detail matched. The curve of his jaw, the faint scar above his eyebrow, even the small freckle on his cheek. But its skin looked stretched too tightly, as if someone had pulled it over a shape it didn't quite fit. The eyes were darker than they should have been, the irises almost swallowed by the pupils. When it spoke, the sound hit him like a physical force. It was his voice, but layered with something else. Something deeper, older, carrying an echo that didn't belong in any human throat. "We've been waiting for you." The words rattled in his bones. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just a murmur, like leaves shifting in the wind. But quickly they grew louder, more insistent, dozens of voices speaking all at once. Some called his name gently, almost pleading. Others hissed it like a curse. The shadows moved again, but not in the way shadows should. They slid across the floor like liquid, pooling and rippling until they reached his feet. Then they rose, curling around his ankles like cold water. Michael's breath hitched. He staggered back, trying to shake them off, but the shadows clung tighter, winding up his legs. They weren't just holding him, they were pulling. The floor beneath him shifted. It no longer felt like concrete. It was softer now, unstable, as if he was standing on wet sand. Each time he tried to lift his foot, it sank deeper. Panic surged through him. His hands shot toward the doorframe, fingers scraping against the rusted metal. But the moment he touched it, the whispers grew louder, sharp and urgent, like they didn't want him to leave. The figure with his face moved closer. It was only a few feet away now, and Michael could see the faint, unnatural smile pulling at its lips. Its eyes didn't blink. The shadows tightened around his knees, their cold seeping into his bones. Michael pulled harder against them, his breath coming in quick bursts. "Let me go," he shouted, though the words sounded small compared to the voices calling his name. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they sounded amused. The figure tilted its head, studying him with a kind of calm patience you'd expect from someone who already knew how the story would end. The floor gave way beneath him, not all at once, but slowly, like the ground itself was melting. His feet sank deep into the black, up to his calves, then his thighs. The cold was unbearable now, spreading through him from the inside out. The figure stepped so close their faces were almost touching. He could feel the breath, his own breath, on his skin. "You came here," it said, voice low and final. "Now you stay." The shadows surged upward in a single motion, swallowing him whole. The last thing Michael saw before the dark claimed him completely was his own face, smiling back at him from the other side. Michael woke with a jolt, his chest heaving as though he'd been running for miles. Cold sweat clung to his skin, his hair damp against his forehead. For a few seconds, his brain scrambled to make sense of where he was. The familiar dim light of his bedroom, the hum of the city outside, the worn comforter tangled around his legs. Then he saw it. The key. It sat on his bedside table, exactly where it had been the night he first received it. But it wasn't the same. The once tarnished brass was now scorched black, its surface cracked like charred wood after fire. The strange symbols carved into it seemed deeper now, the grooves darker, almost like they'd been burned into the metal with something impossibly hot. Michael's heart pounded. His first thought was that it couldn't be real, that the darkness, the doppelganger, the whispers, all of it had been a nightmare. But the key's smell told him otherwise. It carried the acrid, unmistakable scent of burnt metal. He reached for it, hesitating when his fingertips hovered just above it. Even without touching it, he could feel the heat radiating off it, faint but undeniable, as though whatever had happened to it hadn't ended. Before he could decide whether to pick it up, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The sudden vibration made him flinch. He glanced at the screen. One new message, from an unknown number. His thumb hesitated before opening it. 2 words stared back at him, cold and final. "Told you." Michael's stomach knotted. He looked around the room, every shadow suddenly sharper, every sound amplified. The air felt heavier, pressing down on him in a way that made it hard to breathe. Then he noticed his bedroom door. It was open, just slightly. He was certain, absolutely certain, that he'd closed it before going to bed. But now there was a narrow gap, just wide enough for the hallway's darkness to spill into the room. At first, he thought he heard nothing. Just the distant hum of the city, the faint creak of the building settling. But then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Each one landing with a weight that made the floorboards groan. They weren't hurried. They weren't cautious. They were purposeful, like whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted him to hear them coming. Michael's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced through options. Call someone, grab something for protection, run. But he didn't move. It was as if the same pull that had led him to the door in the industrial district was back, only now it was holding him in place. The footsteps drew closer. From the sound, they were maybe halfway down the hallway now. Then closer still. The faint, rhythmic creak of the wood floor vibrated through the walls. He realized, with a cold certainty, that they were headed directly for his room. Michael's eyes darted back to the key. It sat there, glowing faintly in the dim light, as though it were alive. The urge to grab it surged through him. He didn't know why, but some part of him felt certain it was connected to whatever was approaching. Maybe it could protect him. Maybe it was the reason this was happening in the first place. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the apartment. Not the natural quiet of an empty room, but a thick, unnatural stillness that pressed against his ears. Then, a single slow breath from the other side of the door. Michael's hand inched toward the key, but he hesitated. Touching it meant inviting whatever came with it back into his life, or worse, into his room right now. Leaving it meant facing whatever stood just outside that door without it. He didn't get to decide. The door creaked. A fraction of an inch. Then another. The darkness in the hallway seemed to spill in, thicker than it should have been, pooling along the floor. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears. The burn key seemed to hum softly now, almost matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. The gap in the door widened just enough for a shadow to slide across the floorboards. Not the shadow of something standing in the light, but the shadow of something that carried darkness with it. Would you have turned the key? Let me know in the comments.